My name is Kurt Wise. I'm a professor at 𝘎𝘕𝘯𝘴 University in Cleveland, Georgia. And I'd like to talk to you about how theories are formed in young age creationism. I'm going to use one of my own theories as an example. Go back in time to an initial challenge that I ran into. It's very common in science for scientific theories to begin with an observation that seems odd. Something's weird. And for me, the initial challenge that led to this particular theory was while I was going through my formal education at the University of Chicago in a geology major and at Harvard University in geology and paleontology, a claim that had been made a number of times is that the fossil order, the order of fossils in the record, is explained by evolution. The claim was made in a variety of ways, but this summarized a very common claim that exists in the secular world. And to put it more explicitly and carefully, organisms appear in the fossil record in an order that corresponds to the order that evolution predicts. So you first have to take your claim or your whatever you're testing and put it into a form that you can evaluate. And this is the form that I'm going to evaluate. Organisms are appearing in the fossil record in the same order that evolution says they should. And we begin by testing that claim. It was made over and over again, but no one ever actually proved it to me. So I figured one day, hey, I need to do this. I did it actually initially for all organisms. Soon after I completed my doctorate, I looked at all the orders of organisms. When you get the classification of organisms, you got species within genera, within families, within orders, and take all the orders of organisms. And I tested whether the fossil record order was consistent with the order in evolution predicted. And for the most part, I found that it didn't correspond, except in the matter of plants. And so that huge project, I don't have time to go through. I'm just going to go through the plants, the part that seems to work. So how you do it is you first of all have to determine what order evolution predicts that organisms should come into existence. And this is typically done nowadays, at least for the last 30, 40 years. It's been done by creating an evolutionary phylogeny, a hypothetical evolutionary tree for whatever group you're looking at. So I'm looking here at the plants. And these, for the most part, are the major groups of plants, what would be the equivalent of the phyla in animals, called the divisions in plants. A few exceptions, which are actually 𝘎𝘕𝘯𝘬𝘃 is a genus, but otherwise most of these are order level, phylum level, division level classifications. And probably all these names are unfamiliar to most of you. Most of them are fossil organisms and not known in the present. But what you do is use the characteristics of the organisms that we find and create an evolutionary tree, the most likely evolutionary tree based upon their morphology. Once you have a tree, and here it is represented, then you look down at the base of the tree, and the first branch of the tree, whatever comes off of this first branch, should be the first thing evolution predicts came into existence. So 𝘎𝘕𝘯𝘴𝘪𝘴 should have been the first thing formed. If evolution is true, then all the plants we know of, 𝘎𝘕𝘯𝘴𝘪𝘴 should be first. Then 𝘎𝘭𝑔𝑙𝑖𝑜𝑝hyton, then 𝘎𝑟hynchiopsida. Then we have two branches, two groups, Lycopsida and Zostrophalopsida, that should come in next. And then there's two branches that will come in at the same time here. Next in the tree, Phyllocopsida, Equisitopsida. This is the horsetails. Some of these things they're going to become a little more familiar to you as we go along. And the progymnosperms. Then we get the pteridosperms, the seed ferns, get on to the Pinopsida, which would be the evergreens we're familiar with today, Cycadopsida, Nitopsida, and the flowering plants, last of all. So I've given each of them a number corresponding to when they would have occurred, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, so on. And that allows us then to arrange them in an order that evolution predicts with associated numbers. Now again, the claim is that this evolution order is confirmed by the fossil record. So now we have to turn to the fossil record and determine what the order is in the fossil record. So here, if we picture all the rocks of the earth as stacked vertically, then I'm representing in the oldest rocks how many different genera of plants exist at a given time. So at one point there are no plants at all, and then we just have a few, and then the number of genera increases and increases again up towards the present. And I'm topping this off at the upper portion of the Paleozoic. And then what we do is, so we look at the various groups within it. The Horneophytopsida appears down here and only down there. This group right here is the Phyllocopsida, that's the ferns. So there's a rather consistent diversity of ferns going all the way back to a point where they first appear. So once we have indicated on this kind of a chart how many plants are available in each of these groups, now we can determine the order that they appear in the fossil record. So the very first one is the Horneophytopsida. It's given number 1. The next one to appear is the Zostrophylites down here. They appear for the second in the order. Then there's a tie between the Rhinopsida and the Aglaophyton. Then this large group, the Phyllocopsida, comes in. Then the Equisitopsida come in, and then the Lycopsida, Gymnosperms, Pteridosperms, and the Chordates. And so in this manner, we can determine the order of the groups as they actually occurred in the fossil record, the first time they appeared in the fossil record. We can put that right up against the order we predicted from evolution. And looking at this generally, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, it's roughly the same. So non-quantitatively, it looks pretty good, and we can test it quantitatively by basically plotting the rank order of one versus the other, and then determining if there is, in fact, a correlation between the two. If they do appear on very much a straight line, in other words, the first number 1 corresponds to 1, 4 corresponds to 4 here, 5 to 5, 9, 8 to 9. So they have an R squared, have an R of 99, an R squared of 98%. That means 98% of the data is explained by a one-to-one correspondence between the two. We deduce from this that the plant groups, anyway, do appear in an evolutionary order. Very impressively, as a matter of fact. That's an R correlation coefficient that's extremely rare in science, and it indicates we really do have a strong correspondence. Now, keep in mind, rank order statistics are not independent data points, so this is technically not an accurate. We can't interpret this the same way we would with independent data points, but still, it's a very, very strong correlation. If I was an evolutionist, I would stop right there and be very happy. The fossil record order is, in fact, explained by evolution. Evolution, in other words, seems to produce the fossil record order. But I'm not an evolutionist. There's additional data that I have, namely from Scripture, that suggests that all plants do not come from a common ancestor. They did not arise from evolution. So I look at this data and go, oh, this is interesting. It's not what I would expect. I need to find another explanation. So I'm going to look for another cause. Now, if I look back at the evolutionary tree that we developed for the plants, I also remember as I looked at this, as I contemplated this, my paleobotany class, where a comment was made by the professor that the history of the evolution of plants is a history of the evolution of plants from the sea to the land. And so what happened according to evolutionary theory is that plants, algae of the ocean, evolved into land plants, which moved onto land to produce the plants we have today. So the evolutionary tree is one from sea to land, which got me to thinking, what if I examine these same groups of plants and asked a different question, not what is the order predicted by evolution, but what is an ecological order that these plants might have grown in a perfect world? If you've got plants specifically designed for salt water, they're obviously going to be in salt water. You got plants that are specifically designed to be on that transition between salt and fresh water. That's where they would be living. And so on. Perhaps the order of ecology in a perfect world might follow this same pattern. And so I did that. Now I just switched from the evolutionary tree predicted by evolution, to an ecology tree, one predicted by ecology. Maybe you didn't even notice the difference. Let me go back, and you have to look at these branches here closely to see there is a difference. It's not a big difference, but there's a difference. But the point here is that ecology produces very much the same order as evolution does. So let us put numbers on it, the same way I did with the evolutionary tree. So in ecological order, we predict that Horneophytopsida and Angliophyton should be close to the water. And then Rhiniopsida should be next, a little less dependent upon water. See, these earliest plants, or these plants all the way to the left, depend upon standing water to reproduce. They literally release their sperm and their egg into water, and they have to swim together to unite. So these are completely dependent upon standing water. When we get all the way up to the flowering plants, we have things like corn, where the pollen grain that has the gametophyte, it has the male, the equivalent of the sperm, is floated through the air, lands on the silk of the ear of corn, and then grows a pollen tube through that silk to where the gamete can then swim down and mate with the egg. In the process, you don't have to have any standing water. This can be done in dry environments. Thus, we have cornfields in the Midwest where you don't have standing water in the fields. So what I'm going through right now is the order I would predict things to be in if plants that need water are near to water, plants that don't need water are farther away. And so that allows us to put these numbers on there again. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We can put those next to the fossil record order and determine if there's a similarity. And again, there is. The plant groups appear in both. The fossils appear in both an ecological order and an evolutionary order. And the R squared is basically the same. Just slightly better with ecology, but not significantly different. So I can then think, well, maybe the fossils are in the order that they lived in, and that order was reflective of this, of an increasing independence on water. And that got me to thinking about an experience that I had when I was about 12 years old, somewhere around there. A friend of my dad was doing a master's thesis in biology, and took some of us out to a quaking bog. Now in Illinois, state of Illinois, there's only one quaking bog left. These are interesting phenomena. People in the South are not familiar with quaking bogs, but the theory on how they're formed is that a very large piece of ice from the continental ice, the Ice Age, got buried as the ice was retreating, got buried in the sediment, and then melted, producing a lake. And that lake was then overgrown by plants that grew in from the outside of the lake over the top of the lake. So a plant mat grew over the top of the lake, so there's water underneath the mat. And here's a picture of Volo Bog. It's the only one left in Illinois. There's a little bit of water left in the middle of the lake, and the rest of this is actually got water underneath the underneath that vegetation mat. As the plants grow, there's certain plants that grow out over the water first. They're typically very small sedges and reeds and these sorts of things. And then as they grow out and develop a little bit of a, it's somewhat thin, but a layer of vegetation that can capture some dirt, that taller bushes will then grow in that, and increasing the thickness of the mat underneath and supporting taller and taller, progressively taller and taller bushes, even to get to a point where you have entire forests growing over the surface of the lake. The experience I had when I was 12 was that we were taken out to a location, just pulled off the side of the road. He obviously knew where he was going. I didn't know where he was going. There was woods all around us. We got out of the car. We took a trail out into the woods. Very quickly, we are climbing up very steep hills. This is in southwestern Michigan, near Lake Michigan. And very, very steep, 200-foot high hills that then came steeply back down again. I didn't know it then, but I would realize later, these are forests that have grown over sand dunes, 200-foot high sand dunes. So we're going up and down, up and down, up and down, and wondering where we are going and when we are going to stop. When the path changed, it didn't change in the kinds of vegetation, but it changed in topography. We had been going up and down very steep hills. Now it was very flat. And as far as we could see through the woods and along the trail, it was quite flat. We got to a point where the person that was leading us said, okay, let's all stop. And then he had us get together in a circle and grabbed hands. Said, what's going on? Then he said, okay, now at my command, we're going to jump up and down, but we got to jump up and down in sequence. Everybody goes up and down at the same time. So jump up and down, up and down. It took us a while to get into sync, but eventually when we did, I noticed as I came down, I didn't hit the ground at the time I expected to. The ground was below where I expected it to be. And when I lifted off, I noticed that the ground helped me a little bit by pushing up on me. As I looked around at where everybody's feet were, I realized that as we hit, we were bowing the ground down into a circular depression, and that as we pushed up, the ground then came back up again. And then what was that the lip of that depression moved away from us like waves away from you drop a stone in the middle of the in water, you see those round waves moving away. Well, that's what the ground was doing. Waves of the ground were moving away from us, and as they did, I watched bushes that were sitting there that would get hit by this ground wave, and they'd sway as the ground wave hit them and went through them. And then as we get further away, it actually got to trees, and it began to sway the trees. I realized that we must have been, the reason we were flat, the reason we had been walking on a flat surface is because that was vegetation mat over water, and that we were actually floating on water. It was cool. It was amazing. I've never seen anything like it. And so we got done with that, and we continued on the path. As we continued on the path, which is basically towards the center of the quaking bog, and this is called a quaking bog. Quaking because it can move up and down as it floats on the water. The mat became thinner so that we didn't need a whole group of us to make waves. You could stop along the trail and produce your own waves and create and move the plants accordingly. As we got further, I started to get a little concerned because I was thinking, how thick does the mat have to be before you can deform it? Is there a danger of me falling through this mat into the water underneath and not being able to get back out? So eventually, as the trees disappeared and we just had tall bushes, like tall bush cranberries, tall bush blueberries, the ground was getting soft enough that I was a little concerned, and I got down on my hands and knees to spread my weight out. And as I went further and it got to short bushes, I even got down to where I was crawling on the ground. It's really cool because at that point my face, very close to the ground, is right up against, notice, sphagnum moss, Venus flytraps, all those cool carnivorous plants that you never see in the normal woods. I was so excited. This is so cool. Scared to death because I thought I was going to fall through this very thin mat at this point. And eventually it got to where I didn't dare go any further, but I could see open water out in front of me. And again, that was an experience with a floating mat of vegetation in the form of a quaking bog. Eventually, the quaking bog, well, actually the vegetation mat will close in and completely cover that hole and then fill up that water underneath with debris and soil and so on, and then you don't have any lake left. Like I said, in Illinois, there's only one quaking bog left. The rest of them have filled in with time. Now, here are some, they're bad photographs of many years ago, but just to prove to you this is real, this is on Volo Bog. I reached out from the board. They have a floating boardwalk that goes out over the bog. And I reached out and took photographs of myself pushing down. So there is near the edge of the bog, a little bit further in from the water, taller things like ferns. Again, you actually move. A little bit further in, we have cattails, a little bit bigger. And again, the surface is quite flexible, moves up and down. And then here's a small tree about 3 inches in diameter. I was just able to reach it from the boardwalk, and sure enough, I could push that back and forth as well. There are bigger trees further away that I couldn't do that with, but just to show you that this is real. These vegetation mats really do grow out over the water like that. And again, looking at the types of vegetation that grow out on a quaking bog towards the open water. There's an interesting section out here towards the edge where it looks like open water, but if you take a boat out there, you'll notice that there's a false bottom. What looks like the bottom, looks like you could reach out of the boat and step in, but if you put your hand down there, it goes right through this false bottom. Here's a picture from above of the false bottom. You can see a little pollywog swimming around on top of algae and other vegetation that's growing underneath the surface. Then we've got sedges and reeds at the edge of what looks like the open water. A little bit further on, we've got short bushes. A little bit further on, tall bushes. And then in farthest away from the center would be the tall tree zone. Notice that what is true here is that we have different types of plants at different positions away from open water. And that got me to thinking, what if that's what we're talking about in the world before the flood? We're looking at these fossil plants. They are showing an increased independence from water. Plants out here need standing water in order to reproduce. Plants here need less and less water as we move away from the open water. And notice also there's an increase in plant size as we move from open water to a place that has very, very thick or maybe even terrestrial base for it. So we got very short bushes and then taller bushes and then tall bushes and then trees. So we have an increase in size and terrestriality. Looking back at the fossil record, not only is there increased terrestriality, which we demonstrated by the ecological zonation I was talking about before, but also, I remembered in botany class, paleobotany class, these guys down here are little itty bitty plants. They're very small plants. And they actually increase in size, for the most part, up through this sequence. So this is an increase in size and terrestriality, similar to, analogous to, the increase in size and terrestriality in a quaking bog from open water to the shore. So what if we envisioned a floating forest, not connected to the land? Quaking bogs are connected to the land, but I envisioned in my brain then, what if we had a forest that had very tall trees in the middle and thus very thick soil and development underneath it, and then on all directions around it, as you moved away from the center, you would get to shorter and shorter and shorter plants, which require more and more water in order to survive. And that this floating forest, so now let's take that same diagram I had before, lay it down on its side. So now the diversity of plants, how many plants is shown up in vertical here, that we're looking at a reconstruction of this floating forest from the outside edge with short little plants that require water to taller and taller plants, including trees, in the center of this. And again, picture this all the way around, a circular or semicircular floating forest on the pre-flood oceans. So this developed into the floating forest theory, the proposition that before the flood, these plants were actually arranged in a floating forest on the world's oceans. And at the edges would have been Horneophytopsida, Aglaophyton, Rhiniopsida, Sausterphylla, and others. Take these plants and put them up here. This is an artist's reconstruction of what the floating forest would look like from the outside edge to the middle. And again, think of this in all three directions, all directions around. Now, if that was true, then it could exist probably indefinitely before the flood, because even very large, if it's not connected to the land, even if there were tsunamis on the ocean surface, tsunamis just, they show up as many kilometer-long waves that this could just simply ride out and it wouldn't do any damage to it. But in the flood, especially when this might get towards the land, when those waves would break and start ripping this forest apart, that it would tend to rip the outside edge of the forest first and then work its way into the middle. That would deposit the little guys first, and then the taller ones, and so on, all the way up. And that could reproduce or produce the order of plants in the fossil record. So the flood would destroy our floating forest from the outside in. And so it's interesting to think about this. If you go into a museum that natural history museum that reconstructs what the world looked like at various times in the past. They will have dioramas like this that say, this is what the Earth looked like in the early Devonian, which is a layer in the fossil record. Notice we got the Horneophytopsida, the Rhiniophytopsida, several of the little guy plants, and it's portraying at this time in Earth history, that's the only vegetation you see on the Earth. Let's rethink this. Let's accept this landscape reconstruction, but not what's going on across the whole Earth, but this is a picture of the edge of the floating forest, looking out towards the open water. Here all we see are the short plants. They would be out here towards the edge. Other dioramas, such as the famous coal dioramas, my absolute favorite is at the Field Museum of Natural History. Beautiful diorama there in 3 dimensions, full size, that you can walk into, big dragonflies and all that sort of thing. These are actually pictures that are taken, if you wish, at the same time as the early Devonian pictures, but these are in the center of the floating forest. So these would be out in the forest regions of our forest. So you go into a museum and see the dioramas through time. You're not looking at dioramas through time. You're looking at dioramas of the floating forest from the outside to the inside. So the floating forest theory explains the increase in size of plants in the fossil record, the increase in terrestriality of plants in the fossil record. But it doesn't just stop there. What's really cool about the theory is that it goes on and explains some things that the theory was never intended to explain, but come along with it. One observation is, as I made from the beginning, most of these plants are extinct. They don't exist in the present. This theory would actually explain why that is the case. Because a floating forest might be created by God, and it would be stable as a floating forest. But once it's destroyed by the flood, it's never probably ever going to reproduce itself. It's never going to be able to recreate that forest it did before the flood, because the waves of the ocean would break it up too fast. That would explain why most of the plants are actually extinct in the present, because the floating forest was never able to rejuvenate after the flood. Also, another observation is that all of these plants, the early plants in particular, are found in marine sediments. This was something I asked about when I was in those classes. Why is it that we're finding these terrestrial plants in sediments that were in a marine environment? Oh, well, that's because they washed in from the land into the ocean and they're better preserved there. Okay, but another explanation is the reason they're in marine sediments is because this was a marine environment. Even though it's got terrestrial plants, plants that don't live underwater, nonetheless, it is floating in a marine environment, and it was deposited in a marine environment. That would explain why the fossils are found in marine rocks. And that includes the coals that were produced from the center of the continent. Those coals, if you follow them laterally, very often go right into marine sediments off to the side. Also, there are some really weird plants in there. Cool stuff in the fossil record. One thing that is true of even the very large trees in the lower part of the section is that they are basically hollow. Now, this isn't technically true, but when we find the fossils, very often all you have are layers of bark, often with sediment in the middle, as if they were hollow. Technically, they're not quite hollow. We have some really, really good specimens that show that the inside of these things have what we call parenchymatous tissue. Very large celled, open-celled portion of the plant that actually transports air along the length of the rhizoids, those things that we might call roots, and along branches and stems. These are very commonly found in modern plants that actually float in water, because the carbon dioxide that plants need for photosynthesis is in very low concentrations in water. So for very large plants that require a lot of photosynthesis, and they're photosynthesizing underwater, if they are photosynthesizing underwater, then we need to transport carbon dioxide to those structures, and the plant is designed to do that through its stem and through its roots, or rhizoids, to deliver the carbon dioxide. So the fact that we have hollow structured plants in these extinct forms, the stems, the branches, the rootlets, the roots, rhizoids technically, suggests that they're actually water plants, that they're designed to grow and float in water. Second, in the anatomy of these things, is they have a very strange rootlet structure. So coming off the main root, again, technically rhizoid, are these rootlets, which in this reconstruction come off. They're about the size of a typical straw, and they're more flexible than a straw. You can see this in the fossil record. They come off at 90 degrees to the main stalk in all directions. They spiral. The little scars where the straws come off, where the rootlets come off, are arranged in spiral fashion around the rhizoid. There are a few plants in the present that have a root structure like this. They're very small forms of plants analogous to these, and they all grow in water. These kinds of roots can't grow in soil. You can't have a flexible, tiny little straw thing that goes out from the main root into solid soil. They do go out into water like this, and so that would be a second indication that these even trees can be 3-4 feet in diameter, actually grow in water. And this is the kind of root structure you would expect of organisms that grow in water. And they probably supported themselves by intertwining their roots from adjacent trees to stand upright and to be very large. And this was actually a creationist by the name of 𝘎𝘠𝘯𝘕 created a floating coal forest theory back in 1981. I didn't know about this when I did my research initially. I found out about it a little bit later. He was only looking, he wasn't looking at all the little plants I was looking at. He wasn't looking at the entire fossil record of plants. He was only looking at the trees in the middle of the forest. And he proposed that the trees in the middle of the forest were floaters. They actually floated, and they have an anatomical design that's characteristic of floating trees. This theory, my floating forest theory, fits 𝘎𝘠𝘯𝘕's coal forest floating theory as well. Also, this theory brings in a theory of coal formation that another creationist, Steve Austin, introduced in late 1970s. Steve was a graduate student at Penn State University, and he's working on coal. The theory that existed in that day, the popular theory for how coal was formed, is called the coal swamp theory. The idea that the coal, which is a bunch of vegetable material, plant material that's accumulated over time, actually accumulated in coal swamps. That material would fall off of the branches and leaves and so on, would fall off the trees into the swamp waters. And because the swamp waters don't decompose things very rapidly, it accumulates a lot of organic matter at the bottom of the swamp and eventually forms into coal. Now, there are several problems with the coal swamp theory, because when you look at actual coal, and here's a diagrammatic representation of what a coal seam very often looks like in cross-section, very often the bottom of the coal seam is very flat, And the top of the coal seam is very flat. And sometimes there are these seats within the coal. There are layers that are sometimes only a fraction of an inch thick that don't have coal but have mud in them, shale in them. Very often marine fossils in those seats. They're seats because if you take the top layer of coal off, you can actually sit on that bench as if it is a seat. So coal very often, in almost all the cases we know of in eastern U.S. coals, it's got a flat top, a flat base, thin benches, and Steve, when he looked at the coal in thin section, he makes micrographs. He actually takes the coal, slices off pieces, and looks at those pieces under a microscope. He began to deduce that the coal is actually made of bark. Now, right away, this is a problem for coal swamp theory because according to the coal swamp theory, it should be leaves and twigs and that sort of thing that had decomposed or partially decomposed, and probably not bark, or not so much bark. But these seem to almost exclusively be made. He looked at the Kentucky 12 coal seam in particular, that the whole coal seam was made of bark chunks. And not only not tiny pieces of bark, but actually dinner plate sized pieces of bark that are stacked horizontally in order to produce the coal. That is not something you would expect in a coal swamp. Here's Steve back in the days when he was a little less conservative than he is now. He's looking at a drained coal, swamp in Nova Scotia, which is supposed to be a picture of a coal swamp. This is what a coal swamp would be like. But if you look at this, what are these white things that are sticking out of the plant material? Yes, there's a thickness of plant material, but these white things are roots that are growing through the vegetable material. While this was a swamp, the plants up above were growing their roots through the partially decayed plant material underneath them. And when you take this plant material and look at it, there aren't any pieces any bigger than the end of your little finger. They've been decomposed and degraded into tiny little pieces. There are no chunks the size of bark chunks that we find in the coal. And in the coal, we do not find these roots. So modern swamps don't produce this structure. Plus, if you think about this, if there are in fact roots running through the coal or running through the vegetable material, those roots should reach down into the ground underneath, and you should have an uneven base of the coal where the roots are seeking out the soil underneath the decayed plant material. And that's not what you find in coal seams. You find these flat bases up against a nice mud, but the roots are not penetrating into it. How do you get a solid, flat base? The base here is not flat, and it's permeated by roots. Plus, how do you get the flat top? I asked about this while I was going through school myself. I was curious about, well, how do you shave off a forest that's growing on top in the swamp in order to create a flat top? And they said, oh, well, that's probably a hurricane that came through and just shaved everything off. Well, I grew up in Illinois. I hadn't seen hurricanes. I didn't know anything about it. So okay, I'll accept that. Until I visited the site of a hurricane after Hurricane Hugo hit South Carolina. It was a great experience on several levels because the hurricane had come in and taken an actual swamp and decimated it, coastal swamp. This is a great example of this kind of thing. And taken the mud from the swamp and dumped it on top of a town. And when you visit this place, one thing that was not true was that everything was shaved off flat. That place was it was a wreck. There were trees you couldn't walk through it. It did not shave everything off flat. Hurricanes don't do that. They leave this awful mess on top. You would not end up with a flat top surface. Even worse, how do you explain a thin bench? Let's assume that somehow there's a humongous lawnmower that just runs through the swamp and cuts all the vegetation off flat like it looks like you want. Okay. Then mud can come in, like let's say 3/8, ½ inch of mud. It could even be a marine mud. That's okay with marine fossils in it. That's fine. Okay, now let's let the swamp grow back on top of it again to create the next layer of coal. Well, how are you going to keep the roots from the plants that are supposedly dropping the material in to produce the coal in the first place? How do you keep those roots from messing up that beautiful layer of mud that's just right for growing in? You can't do it. How in the world can you get a thin bench in the middle of coal seams? There's nothing about the coal that is explained by the conventional coal hypothesis. That led Steve Austin, doing his PhD dissertation, which he defended in 1979, to produce what he called a floating log mat model. He says he invented this idea while he was in the bathtub watching soap bubbles. There's an amazing number of scientific theories that are developed in showers and bathtubs. I've a number of them in my experience. He's watching the soap bubbles float around and thinking, what if the logs that produce the bark, what if you just had logs, no leaves, because there are no leaves and stuff in here. So let's say you have floating logs of these coal forest trees. And those logs, as I remember, are, as I already said, are hollow, roughly hollow. They've got layers of bark and then parenchymatous tissue that very quickly disappears. These large logs would rotate against one another and peel off those layers of bark. The bark would get waterlogged and fall down to the bottom. He could explain by this theory why the coal is made of chunks of bark. He could explain why it's a flat surface, because if in fact the log mat was floating over a flat surface, the bark would in fact have a flat bottom. Then, after the log mat has been there for a while, the wind blows it away or off to another location. Then you could have mud come in, even with marine fossils in it, marine clams and things like that in it. And then the log mat could blow back over the area and lay down another layer of bark chunks. And that would explain the flat bases, the flat tops, the thin benches, the bark chunk nature of the coal. It was a beautiful theory that Steve Austin produced and defended successfully as a PhD dissertation at Penn State University in 1979. Less than 1 year later, Mount St. Helens blew up, and among other things, a ½ cubic kilometer of rock slid down the side of Mount St. Helens and pushed all the water of Spirit Lake to the north out of its basin into a humongous tidal wave 900 feet high that swept all of the soil and trees off of the surrounding hills. The water comes back in on top of the avalanche debris, now 250 feet higher than it was before, carrying an estimated 1 million logs floating on the top of the lake. The other thing that's interesting about this is in the time it took the avalanche to go down the side of the mountain, an explosion that occurred on Mount St. Helens after the avalanche left and released the pressure on the mountain, a huge explosion, equivalent to 20,000 megaton bombs, exploded across the landscape and tore down the trees, laid them all out in the direction of motion of the cloud. Nuée ardente is what the French would call the cloud. And it had a temperature of about 500 degrees centigrade, so it vaporized all of the branches and the leaves, and leaving only these what look like toothpicks laying on the ground. That explosion overtook the avalanche and wiped out all the trees before the avalanche got to the lake, so that the lake waters brought back in not branches and leaves, but only logs. So it actually created an actual log mat, only logs, and approximately 1 million of them. Now, Steve Austin, this was within 1 year of the guy getting his dissertation, this occurred. And it's a textbook example of what might happen in a floating log mat situation. So he couldn't help himself. He had to go down to the bottom of the lake. He had to get scuba gear, there we go, on, and go down to the bottom of the lake. Sure enough, he found huge pieces of bark scattered all over the bottom of the lake, in some places up to 3 feet thick. So you look at the picture of the lake 11 years afterwards, still about 500,000 logs on the lake at that point. All the logs have been stripped of their bark. They've been moved, rotated against one another. All their bark has come off, fallen down to the bottom of the lake. It's a confirmation of the possibility of a floating log mat producing layers of peat that could become coal in the future. And this theory also, if you consider the fact that if this floating log mat was in an ocean environment, it explained why when you follow these coal seams off laterally, you end up in marine sediments. It also explains why we get carbon-14 ages for coal. Coal is supposed to be the eastern U.S. coal, should be about 300 million years old, roughly, something like that. But we're getting C14 ages in the thousands, the tens of thousands of years, and not the millions of years. Also, if we combine Steve's log mat theory with my floating forest theory, and we assume that his log mat is the result of all the little stuff being completely destroyed, and the only thing that remains are the logs of the large trees at this point, because in that pile of sediment that I talked about, the coal seams are very high, so all of the little stuff has been waterlogged and dropped down to the bottom. All we've got left are logs on the surface. Then we can assume that those logs would account for, and if we assume the logs account for all of the eastern US and European coal, then we're talking about a very large forest. So the forest I'm talking about would be the size of a continent. Let's say the size of North America, floating on the oceans in the pre-flood world. And it probably floated in a near tropical or subtropical latitude on the planet, perhaps in the doldrums of the tropics, and it stayed there for the entire pre-flood period. That would have enough plant material, enough biomass, to actually explain the biomass of the coal that we see around the world. Plus the geographic distribution of that coal. We have coal seams that maybe people are familiar with them in West Virginia and those kinds of areas, but there are coal seams also in Illinois and in westernmost Russia and across Europe. In fact, there are 120 coal seams in Illinois Basin, for example. Those coal seams are the same coal, same composition, same plant material, all the way from Missouri in the west, all the way to the east coast, and then in Europe, from the westernmost Europe all the way to Russia. They're all the same composition. Same plant composition, same animal composition. There's no change in same pollen concentration, as if that entire area was the bathtub. You got water, a body of water that big that this floating log mat was moving back and forth on, dropping material all along the way, producing the many layers in each of those areas, and distributed across all of eastern North America and Europe and westernmost Asia. So the floating forest theory would actually explain why we have the coal where we have it. Also, the fact that when we see the coal, we have a layer of coal, we have mud, we have another layer of coal, we have mud, we have that floating, blowing that material back and forth would explain the alternating and repeating layers of coal and non-coal rocks in the sequence. And as I've already referred to, the composition of the biota, the composition of the animals, the plants, and even the pollen doesn't change up section, not only laterally, but also up section. For my dissertation, I worked on Lingula metalloides and Lingula squamiferus, which are two brachiopods. Those species are found through the entire coal seam, which in conventional dating is 100 million years long. So there's no change in either one of those species for the 100 million years of the coal. Of course, I don't think it's 100 million years. I think it's only deposited in a single year. So the fact that it's got an unchanged biotic composition up the section from top to bottom is explained by the floating forest as well. So the floating forest theory turns out to explain also, this is again something I didn't expect, I didn't create the theory to explain, but realized later, if God created the floating forest and then also created animals that would be appropriate to those various locations in the floating forest. For example, I remember back when I was on that bog, it's not a good idea to be a bipedal organism on a floating mat, because you can pop through and you'd be dead. So you need to spread out your weight. The more you can spread out your weight, the better. So I could see that, especially on the outer edges of this, we would not expect the organisms with their legs, feet underneath their bodies, but in fact the sprawling gait, where actually the weight is distributed more laterally, of the amphibians and and even the modern reptiles. And way out here at the edge in this false bottom, you can't put any weight on that at all, or you'd go through. So what's most appropriate out here are actually fish that can support themselves at that position in the water, but have kind of legs that can grab on and move along that surface. These would be fishopods out here, designed organisms that look like kind of the cross between a land and a sea-dwelling creature. And I realized that the classical fossil intermediates that have been claimed between fish and our modern reptiles and so on, would fit the bill. Tiktaalik, which is basically a fishapod. It's a fish that has legs that can move around on a surface, but without putting pressure on that surface. And then very flat, very large sometimes, but flat organisms that distribute their weight, stay close to the ground, types of amphibians that could live in this area. It would make sense God would create organisms specially designed for each of those areas. And then when the plants are buried from the edge of the floating forest, so would the animals associated with it. And this would explain why we have fish below fishopods, below the salamander below amphibians, below reptiles. So not only does this explain the order of plants, it also explains the order of the vertebrates in the fossil record. So, floating forest theory explains the increase in plant size throughout the Paleozoic, the increase in terrestriality throughout the Paleozoic, explains why Paleozoic plants are nearly extinct. It explains why the why they are stratomorphic intermediates. These would be fossils that are in between supposed ancestors and supposed descendants in just the right order and position in the fossil record. So fish, fishopods, amphibians. It would explain some of the supposedly early plants, and even later plants. The sequence of fossils in the fossil record would be explained by this. It also explains why the Paleozoic plants are in marine rocks, why the Paleozoic trees are hollow, why we have the perpendicular rootlets on those trees, why coal seams are flat-topped, flat-based, and have bark chunks in them, why we have thin coal benches, why we have marine fossils in the coal benches, why we have young coal, why we have a huge biomass of coal, how we can explain that, and the distribution of the coal, and how the coals grade into marine rocks. The things in red here are explained by evolution, but the other things are not. So we have a theory that not only explains the things explained by evolution, and evolution does a good job of explaining a few things, but floating forest theory actually explains even more. Furthermore, the theory is the kind of theory you really want to have because it's synthetic in the sense that it pulled in other theories that had been proposed by others. It pulls in Steve Austin's log mat model and explains where the log mat came from, that he indicates is the source of the coal. It also explains, brings in Chevin's floating forest theory for the plants in the center of the forest. It pulls that into the larger model to explain even more. It's also heuristic in the sense that it tells us where to go from here. If in fact this is true, we can examine things more carefully and we could look for further evidences. For example, what's happened since then is some of these things were already known, but some of these plants some of these trees produce seeds that are boats. And the seeds float and they start germinating while in floating position. And that is consistent with the idea that these are actually trees that grow in water. There's some other very strange designs among the Paleozoic plants that no one's ever figured out. I suspect that some of these, if we look into them more carefully, we're going to see things like plants designed to, let's say, take salt out of the ocean water and create fresh water. I suspect there were such designs among these plants in that floating forest. Things like this that suggest future research, decades of research for many people. So as a result, we have a theory. This is the way theories ought to be. Theories that start from, wonder about that, to you check them out to see if there's something really there to explain. If there is, develop a hypothesis that optimally fits in with other hypotheses and suggests future research and actually fits the data. So I think this is a great example of the kind of theories that creationists ought to be producing all across the board in all fields.